Hey everybody, Professor Dust here. Today we're going to talk about ethical leadership. So far we've categorized all of our concepts, our leadership concepts, into classical approaches, then contemporary approaches, which are more styles, behaviors, and then also we've looked at contexts in which leadership can unfold. This module is a little bit unique in that it does a little bit of both. It has its feet in two different categories. First, you can evaluate ethical leadership as a contemporary style. There is a specific set of behaviors and dimensions that is representative of ethical leadership and that specific type of influence. But then you can also just try and look at what exactly is ethics at large. What does ethics mean? What is that conceptual space interested in terms of outcomes and processes? And so we're going to do a little bit of both. We'll start out talking about ethics at large and what that context is, and then eventually get into what exactly is ethical leadership as a specific contemporary style. So first off, let's define what ethics is. So here's probably the most general yet applicable definition of ethics. It is values and morals an individual or society at large considers to be desirable and or appropriate. And so this definition is both perfect as well as annoying for a handful of reasons. The biggest one is that this still doesn't really help us understand what is ethical behavior. It's purposely broad, but at the same time it's very accurate in that it just depends on what exactly the individual or the society at large thinks at that specific time and in that specific context is the most appropriate. And so it's a moving target. And so the big two questions are what is right or what are wrong given the exact situation that we find ourselves in, and what do you mean by moral? What exactly does that mean? And so ethics is kind of weird in that it is, again, a moving target. It's up to interpretation, and it really is thinking about, did you do or not do what in general other individuals or society at large thinks is the right thing to do? And so with that definition, obviously, you as an individual might be considered ethical in one context and unethical in another context. Now, there clearly are situations where things are considered by everyone to be immoral, but more often than not, there's a small sliver of that overall general society which would say, no, actually that was the right thing to do given the context or given the norms, etc. So it's a sticky one to pin to the wall. So one way to try and think about what exactly is ethical or unethical is to come at it from what's called ethical perspectives or ethical theories. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through a very popular scenario that's been used in philosophy and psychology and sociology for decades to help you think through these different ethical theories or ethical perspectives. So the image here of a trolley car track is representative, and you can look this up on Google sometime. Just look up the trolley car exercise or trolley car in ethics, and you'll see this. So the scenario goes a little bit like this. You are the driver of a trolley car, and you are hurling down the tracks, and you realize that you are about to inevitably run into and kill 5 people on the end of the tracks, some trolley car track workers. And as the driver of the trolley car, you have an option. You are in charge of the steering wheel. You have the opportunity to turn the steering wheel and turn the steering wheel onto a sidetrack. And on that sidetrack is one person. And so try not to get outside of the thought experiment. Just stay within that very basic decision point. The question is, would you or would you not turn the steering wheel as the driver of that trolley car? And think about that for a second. You could save the 5, but just kill 1. Would you do it? Yes or no? Think about that. And again, everybody's different, but the vast majority of people would say, yeah, I would turn that steering wheel. And it's a pure calculation, right? 1 person versus 5. It just seems like pure math. And that is by far the most popular decision point for that specific scenario. But let's change the scenario a little bit and now say that you are an onlooker. You are looking above the trolley car track, perhaps on a bridge of some sort, and you see that a trolley car is heading towards 5 people, and you know it inevitably will take out those 5 people, your only option for saving those 5 people is to push somebody that is standing next to you, also as an onlooker, off of the bridge and onto the trolley car track. Somehow a miracle happens, and you know that that is going to divert the trolley car train off of the track and save those 5 people. So again, same calculation, 1 versus 5, but now as the onlooker, the question is, would you push that onlooker? Right, so think about that for a second. In this scenario, the vast majority of people say, no, I would not push the person off of the bridge. And a variety of rationale is offered, but they didn't mean to be involved. They don't deserve to be involved. If you push the person off of the track, that's essentially, or off of the bridge, that's murder, right? So, but interestingly, as we'll peel back the layers here in a second, that's awfully similar to turning the steering wheel in the first scenario as a driver. A third scenario, you are a doctor and you are back at a hospital in Trolley Car Town, and in comes 5 patients that have been hit by a trolley car, and they all need some vital organ in order to survive. They will inevitably die if they don't get some vital organ, heart, lungs, pancreas, etc. And some young person comes into your office for a checkup, and you have the option of putting that person under during the checkup and stealing the 5 organs out of that healthy person and plopping them into the 5 people that need it and saving their lives. Would you do it? Most people say absolutely not. Number 1, that's gross. Number 2, it's illegal. Right? So we'll talk about those 2 caveats as well, that rationale being a little bit different than simply saying it's murder. So the first scenario that we talked about as the onlooker, this is a great example of a teleological perspective. So what you're doing here is making a calculation. The most popular term that is used for teleological is this utilitarianism perspective. So you're just trying to maximize shareholder returns, for example, if this were a business context. But in this scenario, you're just doing the math, right? 5 versus 1. There's going to be cost, there's going to be benefits. And that's a perfectly reasonable rationale to apply to an ethical scenario. Now, there's a few variations of this teleological approach. You could be a little bit more geared towards calculating self-interests and not necessarily as interested in other interests. That's that ethical egoism. So I need to do whatever it takes to protect my assets, where you perhaps maybe aren't considering the livelihood and assets of your employees, for example. You're very focused on yours, right? Your utilitarian or teleological perspective is very focused on the self rather than everybody else that you influence. Or you could go the other route and apply this cost-benefit calculation, trying to maximize the utility for others, maybe more so than yourself. So corporate social responsibility initiatives or something like that would be a great example of, hey, we're doing the math, but we're doing the math not just about me. I'm really actually focused about doing the math to maximize utility for the masses and everybody at large. Right? So these are the teleological theories. And again, these map onto that example of the driver, right? Where everybody, not everybody, but the vast majority of people would say, yeah, I would turn that wheel. The second perspective is this deontological perspective, where it's based on this idea of what's right and what's wrong. What is the right thing to do based upon some moral guideline that's out there. So it's based on conduct. It's not just about the consequences, how many people were killed, but about the action itself. And so when everybody got into that second scenario and really thought about, is it really okay for me to push somebody that's just an onlooker onto the track and take their lives? And, they didn't want to be a part of this. People think of that more as an act of murder. And so we know that, or not everybody, but most people would assume murder in all circumstances is wrong. So in the workplace, this is an example of tell the truth no matter what. You got to keep promises. Being fair is this fundamental right that everybody deserves. That's a deontological perspective, right? Not necessarily about the maximizing utility, the consequences, but the action itself. A third perspective is this idea of virtue-based theories. And this is more about character And it's not about what you do, but what to be, like who you are as a person. And so this one is a little bit more challenging to kind of see a scenario and say, oh, that must have been based upon a virtue decision or a character decision. But some examples of character traits or virtues of interest, honesty, fairness, humility, all these things that, interestingly, a century ago, this started to dwindle. But, for thousands and thousands of years, for as long as we have writings about leadership and about power and authority, the constant theme was about character. It was never about leadership behaviors like empowerment and or competence or intelligence or dominance. The vast majority of the writing was about character. What does it mean to be a good person? And so there still is, thankfully, inklings of this virtue-based mentality in a lot of what we study in leadership, but by far we've transitioned a little bit out of that being in the forefront of our mind when we think about leadership. And so can virtue-based theories help? Yes. When you have some type of virtue-based mentality, or it's based on character or one of these beneficial traits, when you practice it and you reinforce it, it translates that value into some type of habitual action. Right, so talking about character, the importance of character, and modeling character can trickle down within an organizational setting. So that third scenario that I was talking about, where you were the doctor, that also maps onto another perspective, but it's outside the realm of these three that we're talking about now. So number one, when you say, hey, it's illegal. You can't just take somebody's organs out and give them to somebody else. There's an organ donor list, and that would be giving this person these rights to have these 5 people rights to have new organs, and taking it away from everybody else that was on the list. Right? There's a system for that. Right? So you could also look at the law to decide what's fair, what's legal, what's right, what's moral, etc. And then in addition to that, doctors take a moral code that essentially says, I will do whatever is in the best interest of my patients. And so again, to do something like that in law would be, under a court of law, would be really hard to defend that you made that decision. So there are some legal aspects as well, and we'll tie those back in a little bit later when we talk about ethical leadership. So why is ethical leadership important? Why do we even care about this very specific construct of leadership specific to acting ethically? Well, a long time ago, there was an experiment, the Milgram experiments. You can look this up as well. They're very popular back in the days where psychology experiments became very popular. And this was actually before they had things like the Institutional Review Board, or maybe they had some version of it, but wasn't nearly as stringent what it is now. And what they did was they brought a bunch of random people in, and they said, okay, you're going to be randomly put into one of two groups. You are either going to be a person of authority, you're going to be the teacher, or you're going to be the person that doesn't have authority, you're going to be the learner. And what they did was they quizzed the learners in a memorization type format to see if they could select the correct word. And they hooked up the learner, who is actually an actor. They hooked up the learner to some electric nodes that would shock them if they got the wrong answer. And so the person that was the teacher and who was reading the words, who was in a different room and they couldn't see each other, was listening to a recording, thinking that every time that the learner got something wrong, they would flip a switch and electrocute the individual that was learning. And the more they got wrong, the worse and worse and worse and worse those shocks got. And so they were creating this scenario where the person of authority, the teacher, thought that they were actually shocking the actor or the person who was actually an actor for everything they got wrong, to the point where as they got more and more questions wrong, it was deadly levels of electricity that they thought they were distributing to this person getting the wrong answers. And every time that the teacher would say, this doesn't feel right, and they would ask the person in charge of the experiment, who's this doctor in a lab coat with a clipboard, saying, you need to do this, in a very calm, steady voice, not arguing, but just simply saying, This is what I asked you to do. Please do it. And just that simple prime of, hey, this person's in charge, they got the white coat on, and they told me this is what you have to do, cause these individuals to literally electrocute at deadly levels these learners because they got words wrong. And so this just set off a lot of research on this idea of we are programmed to be obedient to authority. The fact that just because someone told us to do something, we put these blinders on and we say, well, they told me to do it, so I guess I have to do it. And so this experiment or this example has carried forward into what we know about leadership in many different ways in the ethics context. Most people are followers when it comes to ethics. We look to something external. Most of the time it's our leader, our direct supervisor, or maybe to the organization at large to say, what's the right thing to do here? And that's both a good thing and also a terrifying thing, right? That means a lot of power resides within that person of authority, that leader. So how exactly do leaders influence their followers? So there's 4 different theories that people have applied to say, here's why followers are influenced by their leaders. Number 1, social learning theory. We've talked about this a little bit, where followers role model the acts of their leaders. If they're the leader and they think this is the right thing to do, I'm going to role model that behavior because clearly that must be the right thing to do if they're in this position of authority. Another one is sense making. And this is where leaders take situations. A lot of times ethics can be kind of tough to process and it can be gray and there's lots of variables. And so the leader has the potential to make sense of the context and say, here's why this is the right decision and this is the wrong decision based upon all these variables and all these situational components. And that is very helpful in terms of ethical training and mentoring and messaging to make sure people know when you find yourself in a similar thought process, this is the right thing to do. Another one is that leaders are huge contributors to the climate and the culture of organizations. It reinforces values of interest, right? So when leaders stand up and talk about this is our mission, this is our vision, this is our set of values that we believe in, and it has this ethical component to it, it reinforces to followers that, well, clearly this is something that's being monitored, evaluated, etc. And then finally, and we've talked about this before, this trickle-down approach, where if you have ethical leadership at the top, the next level down has a higher likelihood of also engaging in ethical leadership, and then it goes down another level and another level, etc. So there are correlations that trickle down from level to level, which can be helpful. So let's talk about the principles or the dimensions of ethical leadership, right? Sometimes they're called characteristics, sometimes they're called dimensions. In this case, they call them principles. So the first one is being respectful of others. So being empathetic, trying to understand their perspective, being tolerant of differences. Another is serving others, similar to servant leadership, but a little bit more geared towards just being a mentor and a coach and trying to help sure that you're empowering them to do whatever they think is the right thing to do. And then this idea of showing justice. So another word for justice is fairness. Just making sure that whatever you do, it at least is going through a process that seems fair by everybody. So distributive justice is the actual rewards or whatever it is that's being distributed, making sure that they're fairly distributed. And that might be based upon need, it might be based upon equity, that might be based upon priority, or whatever it is, but it has some degree of distributive fairness. And that can also be things like procedural justice, right? Did they really go through and make thoughtful decisions where the procedure was transparent and open and honest? And then it also gets down to things like interpersonal justice and being respectful as well, which bleeds into one of the first dimensions. A fourth one, manifesting honesty. So having this transparency and accountability in all of the acts that they engage in, and then, well, promoting that type of mentality for individuals that they work with. And it's this mantra of, you just do your best and let's have honest conversations with each other. There's no need to hide things. We're all in this together. We're trying to do our best. Getting away from that manipulation mindset to just say, hey, I know you're doing your best. Let's work on it together, and better things will happen than just pretending like we know what we're doing. And then finally, this sense of building community. So having this sense of we want to all socially support each other, and we want to do things that are relatively beneficial for our shareholders, stakeholders, etc. And so I put in this last component here, this moral person, moral manager, as kind of a reminder on the difference and the importance of ethical leadership compared to some other leadership styles. So interestingly, ethical leadership believes that what you do outside of work does actually matter when it comes to how you lead and influence within a work setting. So being a moral person, like having that fundamental grounded mentality of morality throughout life, trickles down or trickles over or spills over into your work life. But then also being a moral manager in that you're less focused on the product per se or what the final output is, and more focused on how they got there. So, for example, in the COVID environment, it almost would be unfair to distribute rewards or promotions, etc., simply based upon number of widgets produced, for example, because the market is just like completely out of whack right now. It almost wouldn't be fair to continue to compensate somebody in that manner. Instead, it's a matter of, well, did you do all the right things? Did you try and adjust? Did you try and set new goals? Did you communicate and handle and adapt and proactively figure out what to do given this environment? Like, that's a focus on process, not necessarily the product. And people appreciate that. Okay, so you'll be reading an article about misconceptions of ethical leadership. And so here's just 4 of the 5 that I think are super important, and to try and give you a few examples that I think are outside of the reading. Number 1, ethics are too gray for leaders to give guidance, right? It's not really important. Leaders should really be focused on the business and the process, and ethics is just something that people got to figure out on their own. But no, research shows that the more explicit that leaders can be on what's right, what's wrong, and why, and give boundaries, because sometimes things are gray, it can increase the ethical behaviors and can decrease unethical behaviors or counterproductive work behaviors. Another one is, well, just make sure that they follow the law. Just really focus on, hey, this is what the law says we can do. That's the standard. That's the line that you do not cross. But laws are up to interpretation. So a lot of times you get down to the nitty-gritty, and what you thought was right based upon the law isn't exactly how the judge interprets it. So you got to be careful. If that's really your standard, you're really playing with fire. Laws aren't as cut and dry as what you think they are. Context can always matter. Sure, sometimes precedents apply more perfectly than others. But a lot of times, it is gray, and therefore you have to figure out how to stay away from that gray area so you don't get yourself in trouble. Another one is bottom line mentality leads to profitability, right? So bottom line leaders just care about the end result, making money by all means necessary. And then in the inverse, ethical leadership, it's too soft and it doesn't care about profitability. But this thinking is misguided in a few different fronts. Number one, people get exhausted pretty quickly with bottom line mentality. It might work in the short term, and this aligns a little bit with what we know about abusive supervision, but in the long term, it doesn't necessarily help. People cut corners, people get exhausted, people get disengaged, where research would suggest that when you're being led by an ethical leader, people are more interested in the long term, they're more committed to the organization, they're more committed to the leader. And when you have talented employees that are committed to the mission, they're more likely to do good work in the long term. Another one, what they do on their own time is not our business. Right? So, hey, if they want to be unethical in their personal life, that doesn't really matter. That doesn't apply to the boundaries of the work environment. But research is pretty clear. What people do in their personal life in terms of ethics and morals is correlated with what they do in the workplace ethics. So if they're taking liberty on their tax returns, if they're more likely to engage in social-oriented initiatives in their home life, they're more likely to care about corporate social responsibility in the work life, right? You can't just separate the self, right? We are one person that operates within multiple contexts, work and home, but it doesn't necessarily completely change who we are at home and in work. So final slide, outcomes of ethical leadership. If looking at ethical leadership as the antecedent or the independent variable, what are some of those consequences or dependent variables? So some of the most popular categories, the most obvious, ethics-related behavior. So if you work for an ethical leader, or they're correlated, right? So if the extent to which ethical leadership increases, ethical behavior also increases, and then also there's a decline in counterproductive work behaviors like neglect and lack of loyalty and shirking and things like that. Another one is just attitudes in general. So people that work for ethical leaders are more satisfied with their job, with their leaders, they're more committed to their organizations and their teams. A third is performance. So research would suggest that ethical leadership is positively correlated with task performance, as well as citizenship behaviors. So things like helping others, advocating for their organization, and then also speaking up. And maybe that has a little bit to do with that sense of ethical leaders creating this sense of psychological safety. They're not afraid to talk about concerns and issues, etc. And then the last one, motivation. So people do expend more effort. They have higher degrees of self-efficacy. They believe in themselves and their ability to accomplish their work, perhaps because it's focused on process, not product. And another one is psychological empowerment. So they find meaning in their work and it's impactful. They feel more competent and self-determined in what they do. So all of these are outcomes of ethical leadership, and these are kind of putting together that conceptual model of why exactly is ethical leadership so important. So that's it. And I think that summarizes nicely at least the big picture of what is ethics, recognizing that there's different perspectives that people can take about ethics, and that sometimes you can come at things from very different points of view and think that something's ethical or unethical, and then also trying to understand what exactly is ethical leadership. So breaking down those dimensions and understanding what exactly those are and how that gestalt construct of ethical leadership as a contemporary leadership theory, what is that influence style or behavior, and then looking here at things like the outcomes of ethical leadership as well. Why does it matter? How does it influence followers? And then understanding what that process is. Why do these outcome variables happen? So things like the social learning, sense making, etc. All right, that's it. Good luck.